It was a dark and stormy night when John first met the killer. He had been walking home from his late-night shift at the diner when he heard a scream coming from a nearby alleyway. As he approached the source of the sound, he saw a man holding a knife over a woman's body. Without thinking, John tackled the man to the ground and held him until the police arrived. The man turned out to be a notorious killer who had been terrorizing the city for years. He had killed at least 5 people that the police knew of, and they suspected there were many more victims. The killer's name was David, and he was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes. After the incident, John became somewhat of a hero in the city. He was interviewed by local news stations and even received a commendation from the police department. However, as time passed, John started to feel a sense of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that David's arrest wasn't the end of the story. One day, John received a package in the mail. It was a letter from David, who had somehow managed to get John's address. In the letter, David thanked John for saving him from a life of loneliness and boredom. He said that killing had been the only thing that made him feel alive, and now that he was in prison, he had nothing left to live for. He then went on to say that he had left a series of clues around the city, and if John could solve the puzzle, he would reveal the location of his next victim. John was terrified by the letter, but he couldn't ignore it. He started to investigate the clues, which led him to different parts of the city. Each clue was more cryptic than the last, and John felt like he was in a race against time. He couldn't let David kill again. As John got closer to solving the puzzle, he started to notice strange things happening around him. He would hear footsteps behind him when he was alone, and he would catch glimpses of someone watching him from a distance. He couldn't tell if it was just his imagination or if David was somehow following him. Finally, John solved the puzzle, and it led him to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He knew that he had to be careful, so he called the police and waited for them to arrive. When they got there, they found David waiting for them with a knife. He had managed to escape from prison and had been hiding out in the warehouse ever since. There was a standoff between David and the police, but eventually, David was apprehended. He was sent back to prison, and John thought that it was all over. However, a few days later, John received another letter from David. This time, the letter contained a message that sent chills down John's spine. You may have won this round, but the game is far from over. John knew that he couldn't let David win, so he continued to investigate. He started to uncover a network of people who had been helping David from the outside. They were sending him messages and helping him escape from prison. John realized that he was in way over his head, but he couldn't stop now. He had to see this through to the end. As John dug deeper, he started to realize that David was not acting alone. He had a group of followers who believed in his twisted ideology. They were willing to do anything to help him achieve his goal, which was to become the most notorious killer in history. In the end, John managed to stop David and his followers from carrying out their plan. It wasn't easy, and he lost some people he cared about along the way, but he knew that he had done the right thing. David and his accomplices were arrested and sent to prison for life, and the city finally breathed a sigh of relief. However, John knew that he would never be able to forget what had happened. The experience had changed him in ways that he couldn't fully comprehend. He had seen the darkest side of humanity, and it had left a mark on his soul. As time passed, John tried to move on with his life. He got a new job and made new friends, but he always felt like he was looking over his shoulder. He couldn't help but wonder if there were other killers out there, waiting to take David's place. Years went by, and John became an old man. He had retired and moved to a quiet town in the countryside, far away from the city where he had fought his battles. He thought that he had left his past behind, but one day, he received a letter in the mail. It was from David, who had somehow managed to get his address. The letter contained only one sentence: "I told you the game wasn't over." John felt a chill run down his spine as he read the letter. He knew that he was in danger, but he also knew that he couldn't run anymore. He had to face David one last time. He called the police and told them everything. They tried to reassure him, but John knew that he was on his own. He had to confront David himself. He went back to the city, to the same alleyway where he had first met David all those years ago. He waited there, in the pouring rain, with nothing but a pocket knife for protection. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew that he had to be brave. Finally, David appeared out of the shadows. He looked older and more frail than John remembered, but his eyes were still full of malice. "I knew you would come," David said, with a wicked smile on his face. John didn't say anything. He just stood there, waiting for David to make his move. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then, suddenly, David lunged at John with a knife. John managed to dodge the attack and counter with his own knife, but he was no match for David's skill. They fought for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was only a few minutes. In the end, John managed to disarm David and hold him to the ground. As he looked down at the man who had haunted him for so long, John felt a sense of closure. He knew that he had finally won the game. The police arrived soon after and took David away. John went back to his new life, but he knew that he would never forget the lessons he had learned. He had seen the worst in people, but he had also seen the best in himself. And that was something that no killer could ever take away from him.